Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you all who are here and listening. As Jeff indicated, there'll be there's overlap, as you can see, as the speakers go by on some of the issues here. I'm here from the perspective of a group of a committee of the National Academy of Sciences, the Committee on National Statistics, for which I served from 2012 to 2018. So like Barbara, I'm doing this just right after having ended this, and the last thing I was involved in was the preparation of what is now called a letter report, which I'll get to at the end of the presentation, from the NAS on the question of should there be a citizenship question added to the census, and what we examined that from the perspective of scientifically of what is the justification for this and what's the evidence for what kind of effects that it might have. I'm going to start a little broader than that based on what you've heard. The census, and there's a larger system of what's called the federal statistical system, in which the census is the largest unit, that we generally take for granted most of the time. We assume that it's there, that it does the kinds of things that is indicated that the census does, that other parts of it, such as the Bureau of Labor Statistics, tell us what the situation is in the country with respect to the Consumer Price Index, the unemployment rate, and other parts of it do analysis in all kinds of areas. And I'll get in a minute to more information than you ever would want to know, or at least in a short period of time, as to how this system is embedded in the federal government. I think what I've come to appreciate in the 6 years I spent on the Committee of National Statistics is not how important this is as a resource for information, certainly for science. The whole areas in which Jeff indicated I've worked are fundamentally grounded in the data that are collected and disseminated through the census, through the National Center for Health Statistics, and other aspects of the federal statistical system. I have gotten greater appreciation, as Al's presentation suggested, of the breadth of use that is and value that these data have for the functioning of our society, for the public sector at all levels, as has been indicated in terms of allocation of resources, very much for the private sector as well, from which Al came from, in which he's very sensitive to the fact that private organizations use these data all the time in their work, as do public organizations at all levels. What I have become most aware of, in some sense, is how politically integrated, let's put it, and meshed the federal statistical system is in the broader nature of our government and the broader nature of the politics in our society. And as Senator Peters' presentation suggested, it's a system that is increasingly challenged technologically around the issues that will be talked about more later in the morning, around how do you manage, collect data, disseminate it, and do so in a way that protects the privacy of individuals. It's increasingly challenged economically in the way that almost all aspects of our governmental and public or public goods infrastructure in this country are challenged. They have less money to try to do more things with it. And as we're seeing in part around this particular citizenship question, it's challenged politically these days as well. It's not clear that substantial parts of our society really understand and appreciate the importance of these institutions to the functioning of a democratic society. And if we lose that appreciation, we are at risk of losing one of the key foundations of a well-functioning democratic society. So let me just try to make a few comments here of a kind of background nature along these lines. First is a point that you've heard something about already. The Census Bureau and the broader U.S. Federal Statistical System, or FSS, as I've abbreviated it here, derives from and hence is inherently enmeshed in our political system. You've already heard from Al that the census, or at least the process of enumerating the population every 10 years, is front and center in the Constitution of the United States. It's in Article 1, Section 2, that there will be an enumeration. And this has been carried out in various ways from 1790 through the present, and originally by U.S. Marshals, then through decennial census offices, were supervised through the Secretary of State. And the Census Bureau as it exists today, or has evolved today, is a creature of the 20th and 21st century. A whole series of other agencies have been established in the same way to deal with subsequent needs and problems that the society recognizes and develop. The economic and occupational and labor sector is a very large one that has been handled through the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which was organized between 1884 and 1913 and continues to function today in very important ways. And one of the last of these that's been formed is something called the Energy Information Administration, which basically grew out of the energy crisis of the 1970s and the discovery that we needed to understand and know how much energy do we have? Where is it coming from? How much is it costing us? And so on. And so we now have areas, we have the similar areas in education, agriculture, etc. The second point that I'd like to drive home is that each of these agencies, that's a very decentralized system. Many other countries have a sort of central Office of National Statistics. Canada has something along with Statistics Canada. United Kingdom is not quite that way, but they have a central concern for it. There's an almost cabinet-level position in the UK that's charged with protecting and promoting the ability of the federal statistical system in the UK to function and operate as an independent and nonpartisan and unbiased provider of information to the society. In the US, this is complicated considerably by the way things are organized here. You're never going to fully read everything in this table. I'm just going to try to see if I can, I guess, does the pointer show up? I guess it doesn't that way, so I'll have to do it this way for you to see. The important element to recognize is that every one of the statistical agencies, and over here on this, whoops, there we go. There's the pointer. On the right side are the various statistical agencies. They are embedded underneath various committees that provide appropriations and oversight from the Congress, and they are embedded in different administrative portions of the executive of the federal government. The boxes in this figure, whoops, I keep hitting that, such as here and here and so forth, every box indicates a position that is a presidential appointment. So it is nominated by the president and goes through the federal confirmation hearings, such that one of the recent one for Justice Kavanaugh is an example of that on a large scale, but that happens all the time. As I'll come to in a minute, 3 of the directors of agencies are actually presidential appointees. I didn't realize that until our Bob Groves from here was nominated for the census and went through a full-scale nomination process. So the outcome of this is that the administrators and most of the rest of the staff here are federal civil service employees. And from my experience, let me tell you, these are incredibly capable and dedicated people. And they work under increasingly difficult conditions to try to fulfill some of the things that I will indicate in a moment are the key functions that a statistical agency or the whole system are supposed to fulfill. Let me just to point out that there are 3 of these directors. Normally you'll see pretty soon the director gets back to and reports to somebody who is a presidential appointee. So the political system sits over this, and that, as Barbara and other people have indicated, Secretary Wilbur Ross, as the Secretary of Commerce, and operating through his undersecretaries and so forth, has the right to give instructions to the Bureau of the Census as to how they are supposed to operate. It's interesting, the other agencies that are involved here, the second one that has been there for a long time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and as I said, that does the CPI, the unemployment rate, and a variety of other important things about the functioning of the economy and the labor system in the country. And the third one is the Energy Administration, which is a relatively small operation. But you may be able to infer what these three have in common. These are all the organizations that produce politically important and sensitive information, along with that information being important generally to the function of the society. So these positions and these agencies are under a great deal of political challenge all the time in terms of how they do their work. If you have time at some point, you can look through this whole table. I found it quite interesting and kept learning things as I looked at it. Let me make one other third point, and this gets into where my particular relevance this morning comes from, is that since 1972, the National Academy of Sciences has had a group called the Committee on National Statistics, the function of which is to provide unbiased scientific advice and counsel to any and all of the federal statistical agencies, largely at their request or at the request of Congress to consider aspects of how they function, or in other ways. And it's by virtue of this being on this committee that I got involved in the particular issue of the citizenship question. Let me just, before I get to that, indicate a couple of things that's important. Here is the website that I'm going to get to where you can go to find a volume that the Committee on National Statistics has produced now through 6 editions and tends to use and provide at the beginning of each new administration to the political members of the administration and to the people in the statistical agencies regarding what a federal statistical agency is supposed to be doing for the government and for the society more broadly. This volume is organized basically in terms of 4 basic principles for what an agency is supposed to do. So the Census Bureau and any other is supposed to be providing information that is relevant to policy issues. And it's to be objective, accurate, timely, and that can be used in the policy process. Secondly, it's critical, as Al has indicated in his presentation, that in doing that, that the agency has credibility among its data users. People who use the data need to know and understand and believe that that data is accurate. In the age in which all information is being increasingly challenged as to whether it is, quote, real or valid or not, the federal statistical agencies stand as one of the ultimate foundations for information that can be used with confidence and trust by data users, and they've been seen that way for years. And thirdly, as Al indicated, it's critical that federal statistical agencies be trusted by the people who provide them with their data, whether those are the individuals providing data to the census or organizations that provide information for the economic censuses and so forth. And they need to know, again, understand what the reasons for this are, how the data are used, and that their data is being kept confidential, and that is the law as of this point in time. And finally, in the latest edition of this book, there was a 4th principle added to emphasize the importance of the independence of statistical agencies from political and other undue external influences. And I don't think I need to, given the context of the discussion to this point, to indicate why it was felt to be important at this time to emphasize that as the 4th thing. So in thinking about what happens with the the citizenship question or anything else that is done with the operation of a federal statistical agency like the census, one needs to keep in mind what is it going to do to these things. And as people have discussed already, we're dealing with something that's highly policy relevant, but has major issues in terms of potentially undermining the credibility of the data from the perspective of the users, providers, and politicizing the entire process. There are a whole series in this volume, and we won't have time to go in them, but again, if you go to the website, you can find them. There are a set of specific operational principles that affect these things, that include things like confidentiality, verifiability of data, oversight by appropriate scientific and other checks to make sure that the agency is operating functionally. As Senator Peters mentioned, he requested the GAO to take a look at what's the census doing to protect confidentiality of data, and that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do. So now let me just get to the ongoing, whether you want to call it concern, controversy, or opposition to the addition of the citizenship question to the 2020 census. It's worth knowing a little background, I think, in just thinking about this. It is not that citizenship has never been asked in the census. It has been asked. Has been asked in varying ways over time. There have been questions about birth origins or citizenship from 1820 and 1830. There was a hiatus around the Civil War, and then it picked up again in 1870 and continued from 1819 to 1950. But then it was dropped, so it's now been almost 7 decades since the citizenship question was answered. The question was answered at the request of and at the expense of the state of New York and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in 1960 for help for them in understanding who was a citizen of what and where. And as has been indicated, but to help people recognize this, the census historically has been a relatively brief document that worked from the principle that the census's main function was to, quote, enumerate the population. Over time, other questions around things like citizenship, around education, around work that people did, and so forth, got added to the census. And it got a little bit unwieldy in certain ways. And in 1970, a decision was made to separate the census into what is called the brief short-form census, which every household in the country gets and answers, and a long form of the census, which was given to, I think, this is consistent, Barbara said, about 1/6 of the households, and it's been in the range of 15 to 20% generally. And on that, there was a longer set of information about the kinds of things that I just mentioned. After 2000, the long form has been discontinued and replaced by something that Barbara mentioned that may not be clear to everybody, called the American Community Survey, which is an ongoing annual survey that over the course of a decade is intended to produce the same size and body of information that was produced from the long form, but to produce it in a way that keeps it constantly up to date with changes in the nature of the population. And as Barbara indicated, currently that's about 3 million households a year are being covered via the ACS. And the ACS comes up in ways that she's already mentioned that are important. As you know, there are the controversy here is ongoing in various places. There is the congressional legislation that Senator Peters has been a leader on that is sitting. It is not going to go through the Congress as it is now constituted, and obviously the election will determine whether any legislation of that type will ever move forward out of the Congress. There are lawsuits ongoing, and again, as he mentioned, the largest of those is in the state of New York. It is due to come to trial in November, and it is now being held up by another appeal, again, that Senator Peters mentioned, by the Commerce Department to avoid Secretary Ross having to testify or otherwise give depositions or statements as part of that hearing. But whenever that logjam is passed, and many of you may know about or even be involved in some of the entities and organizations that are doing that, undoubtedly, I think wherever it goes initially will probably go all the way up to the Supreme Court, and we don't know what will happen out of those two things. In the meantime, there is a normal process that goes on for changes of any kind that are made in the government in which there is public comment and input allowed, and that's going on right now with respect to the census. And that's the context in which the Committee on National Statistics did this letter report trying to indicate what do we think about the scientific justification, need, and potential impact of the citizenship question. And that report is available also publicly on the National Academy's website. In that thing, we come down based on consideration of our committee, which is independent of the one that Barbara was part of, with a conclusion that it is not a good idea to add a citizenship question at this time. And one has to recognize what is now being talked about is adding the citizenship question to the short form, which currently has 10 questions on it. So this is adding, a kind of 10% question increment. It's a very prominent one. It's not like this is going to be hidden in the midst of a lot of other information. It is very prominent, it's very public, and at this point anybody is going to know about it if it ends up being there. The reasons we came down against it was first was looking at the scientific, is there a basis for this given any of the so far stated reasons and needs for having the citizenship question, most of which have revolved around, quote, ability to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. And again, our conclusion, as others, is that the American Community Survey provides all the information that has been needed for a half century, or through the long form and now through the ACS. There's all the information that's needed there to fulfill the functions that are being asked for. Secondly, the report says that it clearly almost certainly will impair and damage aspects of the quality of the census. Unfortunately, no one has empirical data at this point in time to say definitively what that would be. If we could say definitively that we know from prior information that putting a question like this on here depresses the response rate by 10%, the issue would be very different than it is right now. We unfortunately don't have that information. But all the indications are that it is likely to do that. It's likely to, there are problems in this. This is treated as, quote, reinstating. Secretary Ross has said we're reinstating the citizenship question. Well, that's not exactly the case because it hasn't really been asked in exactly this context in this form before. And as Senator Peters emphasized, the normal process in the census is extensive testing over 3 to 5 years of any new content that goes into the survey. That is impossible given the date that the request was made. And so this would be essentially being put in there with no prior information about its effect. And it will undoubtedly, or at least very likely, drive up the costs at the same time that it's lowering the quality. As Barbara attested to, there is this prior incidence, which is relevant here. If it were the case that the citizenship question totally or in very major ways impaired the functioning and the quality of the 2020 census, it is possible that that could be used as a justification for not using the 2020 census to reapportion representation in the House of Representatives. And we would be back in a situation under slightly different circumstances and reasons as existed in the 1920s, and that's obviously, as we know, a very politically consequential thing. It's not sure that that could happen, and no one, certainly the Census Bureau itself, is doing everything it can under the circumstances to try to make sure there is a successful census. And finally, there was the conclusion that, that to insert a question like this, where there has been from Secretary Ross and others statements that this information would be used to help to develop a national register of citizenship. And that is a use of census data that is a violation of the principles that I've just indicated, and it's a violation of the current legal statutes on the way that census information can be used or transferred in other ways. So on that basis, our conclusion was this was bad. That comment period has just ended. All of that information is being processed. We don't know what will come out of that as of now. So in conclusion, I would just to suggest to you that you may not have thought so, and I'm not sure I would have thought so 8 or 10 years ago, that the federal statistical system is a big, quote, political issue, but it really is. In the same way that the president appoints people to the courts and the Supreme Court, and that's a political issue, the president appoints people who oversee the operation of the statistical system, and the Congress in its own way advises, counsels, and legislates in that process as well. So when you're voting, to the extent that you can, think about what the implications of your vote is likely to be in terms of the operation of your, not only the federal system, but this goes down as well at the level of states which have comparable kinds of things. If you're interested in a bunch of these issues, this is a thing that I came across in doing this. It's a law review article that provides a very nice review of the history of the use of the census and the principles that have been applied in apportioning representation in the House of Representatives, and you'd be amazed at how many different ways and forms that has taken over the history of the country, and any of those are still possible given the fact that there is nothing mandated in the Constitution about the way, except an apportionment across the states somehow appropriate to a population. There is no other requirements on the nature of the districts, the size of districts, and so on and so forth. So with that, I hope you will be able to think a little bit better about the issue as it continues to go forward from here, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion as I have enjoyed the prior presentation. So thank you very much.